After the harvest of grapes back in the autumn, vines go into a state of dormancy over the winter to protect themselves from the cold. The leaves all drop off and the stalks turn from a vibrant green into brown in a process called lignification. This forms a hard, woody layer over the top of the living plant. A vine grows in little segments called nodes, and at each of these nodes is where the leaves, the tendrils, and also the grapes grow. During the winter season, this is where buds are generated on every single node, and inside that bud, the future of the plant is already defined. All the new shoots, the leaves and the flowers are all there in embryonic form. There are even 2 backup buds for just in case the frost kills off the primary one. But the trouble is, there are just far too many of them. All the new growth which came from one bud the previous year will create maybe 20 or 30 of its own buds the next year. It's exponential growth, and that leads to underripe grapes. It will also be all over the place, so we need to prune, and we've now come to the perfect time of the year in England to prune our vines. We want to do this as late as we can, which delays when the buds pop open and become vulnerable to the frost. We also want to do this when it's still very cold, the sap hasn't started to rise up into the dormant plant, and we want to do this when it is dry and preferably a little bit breezy, so disease cannot get in where we just basically cut a massive hole in the plant. Pruning is a massive gambling act because you never know what kind of a growing season is coming up. If it's a great one and you leave too few buds, then the shoots will grow like crazy and the grapes will ripen far too early, making really high alcohol wines with quite unpleasant flavours. But if you leave too many, the opposite will happen. Not enough sugar to make alcohol and very, very sour, bitter grapes. So pruning is an exercise in trying to work out how many grapes you're going to grow this year from each vine and getting them to go where you want them, all at the same height, getting ripe at the same time. Now the gardeners out there will probably know this, but there are essentially 2 methods of pruning: cane pruning and spur pruning. Cane pruning is generally used in places like Chablis, England, Alsace and Champagne, where it's just a bit cooler, and you'll find plenty of spur pruning in warm regions like Spain and Australia. Now spur pruning is generally seen as being a lot easier and lower cost. It can quite often be done by machine, but it can be more susceptible to disease. And that is because with cane pruning you replace a lot of the wood every single year. If you look at 2 young vines, you'll really struggle to see much difference. They're the same shape, but it gets exaggerated every year that goes by. An old spur pruned plant will have these thick arms which reach out from the central trunk, whereas a cane pruned plant will have a thick trunk but spindly little arms. It took me quite a long time to really get this difference, with several months of sitting in freezing cold vineyards wearing thermal socks. And I've now got a couple of vines that I keep in my garden as examples of how this all works, so I can show you. Now it's important to remember that on both of these methods, all new shoots and grapes pretty much come from the wood that grew just last year. So that's what we're deciding what we leave behind: 1-year-old wood. With a cane pruned plant, we take 1 or 2 of the shoots that grew last year, we cut everything else away and we bend them down to be horizontal. These canes will have buds all the way along them, perhaps every 15 to 20 centimetres. We leave as many buds as we decide the plant will be able to cope with the next year, which depends on how hot it is. And that is called the charge. There are some calculations to help you work out what the charge should be, how many buds to leave, based on how much of the wood you cut off last year. With spur pruning it's a lot easier. We cut each of last year's shoots back just down to a tiny little spur, maybe just 5 centimetres long, that has just 1 or 2 buds on it. On a cordon training system, which is say the classic shape with 2 arms sticking out the side, these spurs are all roughly at the same height along a wire, which means that the pruning pretty much follows a horizontal line along the rows of vines. A tractor with a big mechanical cutting wheel can be used to do this, and then a viticulturist follows along and makes slightly more accurate cuts. And that is why it's generally only done for premium wines. But does that difficult system make the wine taste any better? To be honest, I don't think so. To me, cane pruning is more of an insurance policy against having disease get into the pruning wound and kill one of the arms of your vine that's maybe been growing for 50 years, and that halves your yield. But it also gives a lot more flexibility in a changing environment, which is perhaps why it is so popular in this country, where everything is being worked out for the first time.